The paradox of value. The paradox of value, also known as the diamond water paradox, is a classic problem in economics and philosophy that highlights the puzzling difference between an item's use value and its exchange value. It was famously discussed by thinkers such as Plato, Aristotle, John Locke, and most notably Adam Smith, the father of modern economics. The paradox arises when we compare the value of two goods that seem to have drastically different prices despite their apparent usefulness. Take water and diamonds. Water is absolutely essential for human survival, while diamonds are primarily decorative. Without water, life cannot exist. Yet, in a market economy, water is often very cheap, or even free in some places, while diamonds command extremely high prices. Why is something so crucial to life valued so little in monetary terms, while something non-essential is so expensive? This contradiction between necessity and price is the heart of the paradox. If value were based purely on usefulness or importance, then water should be worth far more than diamonds. But in practice, the opposite is often true. The resolution to the paradox lies in understanding marginal utility, a concept developed later by economists such as Carl Menger, William Stanley Jevons, and Leon Walras in the 19th century. Marginal utility refers to the additional satisfaction or benefit a person gets from consuming one more unit of a good. It's not the total usefulness of the good that determines its price, but rather how much people are willing to pay for an extra unit of it, given its availability and their needs. Water, while essential, is usually abundant in most environments. Because it is easy to access, the marginal utility of an extra cup of water is relatively low. People already have enough to drink, wash, and cook. Diamonds, on the other hand, are scarce and difficult to extract. Their marginal utility remains high because they are rare, desired for their aesthetic and symbolic value, and not readily available. People are willing to pay a premium for that rarity, not because diamonds are useful in a survival sense, but because their scarcity and social meaning give them high exchange value. Thus, the paradox of value dissolves once we separate total utility from marginal utility. Water has high total utility but low marginal utility, leading to low prices in most contexts. Diamonds have low total utility but high marginal utility, leading to high prices. The market reflects not the absolute importance of a good, but its relative scarcity and the subjective valuation placed on each additional unit. This paradox remains a foundational concept in economics, teaching us that value is not an objective property of things but a dynamic result of human needs, preferences, and available supply. It highlights how price, usefulness, and scarcity interact in complex ways that can defy our initial intuition but make perfect sense under deeper analysis. The paradox of freedom. The paradox of freedom is a philosophical dilemma that arises when we consider the consequences of unlimited or absolute freedom in a society. At first glance, freedom seems like an unequivocally good ideal, one that allows individuals to think, act, speak, and live according to their own will. But the paradox emerges when we recognize that if everyone is completely free to do whatever they want, that freedom can, in practice, destroy itself. The idea can be framed like this: if people are entirely free, then some will inevitably choose to use that freedom to dominate, exploit, or oppress others. In a system of total freedom, nothing inherently prevents a powerful individual or group from suppressing the freedoms of others through coercion, violence, or manipulation. In this way, absolute freedom can lead to its opposite, tyranny or anarchy where only the strongest prevail. This paradox has been explored by numerous thinkers throughout history, including Karl Popper, who formulated a related idea known as the paradox of tolerance. But in the context of freedom, the core concern is this: a society that guarantees unrestricted liberty to all may end up allowing certain forces to erode that liberty from within. For example, consider freedom of speech. If this freedom is extended without any limitations, it might include the freedom to incite violence, spread misinformation, or promote ideologies that aim to eliminate the very freedom that allows them to be expressed. If a society tolerates such uses of freedom without boundaries, it may unwittingly pave the way for authoritarianism or social collapse. This leads to a philosophical and political tension. To preserve a just and free society, some freedoms may need to be curtailed, not to suppress liberty, but to protect it. Laws, norms, and institutions often place limits on individual behavior to prevent harm, protect rights, and ensure fairness. These restrictions can seem like violations of freedom, but paradoxically, they are necessary to uphold a broader, more sustainable version of it. The paradox is not about denying freedom but about recognizing that freedom without structure or limits becomes unstable. If freedom becomes license, if there is no distinction between liberty and lawlessness, then the very conditions that make freedom possible are undermined. A society where anyone can do anything at any time is not truly free, it is chaotic and dangerous. In modern terms, this paradox shows up in debates about civil liberties, government regulation, free markets, and social responsibility. How much freedom should individuals have? When do restrictions become oppression, and when are they necessary protections? Where should the line be drawn between freedom from interference and freedom within a just order? Ultimately, the paradox of freedom teaches us that freedom must be balanced with responsibility, and that sustaining liberty requires more than simply removing all constraints. It requires thoughtful boundaries, moral norms, and collective safeguards that ensure freedom does not become a tool for its own destruction. In this sense, true freedom is not the absence of all rules, but the presence of the right ones. The Twin Paradox. The Twin Paradox is one of the most famous and fascinating thought experiments in modern physics, particularly in the theory of special relativity, developed by Albert Einstein. Despite its name, it is not a true logical paradox in the sense of being a contradiction, but rather a counterintuitive scenario that challenges our everyday understanding of time, motion, and simultaneity. The resolution lies not in finding a flaw in relativity, but in understanding the subtle way time behaves in different frames of reference. The scenario typically goes like this: imagine two identical twins on Earth. One twin remains on Earth, the stay-at-home twin, while the other twin boards a spaceship and travels at a speed close to the speed of light to a distant star, then turns around and comes back. According to the principles of special relativity, the traveling twin will experience time dilation, that is, time will pass more slowly for them relative to the twin who remains on Earth. From the perspective of the stay-at-home twin, the traveler's clock ticks more slowly during the entire journey. So when the traveling twin returns to Earth, they will have aged less than their sibling. For example, if the trip takes 10 years according to the Earth twin, the traveling twin may have experienced only 6 years due to the effects of high-speed motion. This result has been experimentally confirmed with precise atomic clocks flown on airplanes or placed on satellites, where clocks moving at high speeds tick slightly slower than those on the ground. Here's where the apparent paradox arises: relativity is symmetric. That is, in the framework of special relativity, there is no absolute motion, only motion relative to something else. So, couldn't the traveling twin say that they were at rest and that the Earth twin was the one moving away and then coming back? If so, wouldn't the Earth twin be the one who aged less? How can both twins see the other as aging more slowly? This question seems to suggest a contradiction in the logic of special relativity. But the key to resolving the paradox lies in recognizing that the situation is not truly symmetric. The two twins do not undergo the same experiences. The twin who travels to the stars and back undergoes acceleration and deceleration, changing frames of reference, especially when turning around at the midpoint of the journey. In contrast, the Earth-bound twin remains in a single inertial frame for the entire duration. Special relativity applies most directly to inertial frames, those that are not accelerating. The moment the traveling twin turns around to return to Earth, they shift from one inertial frame to another, breaking the symmetry. This acceleration introduces what can be thought of as a global time shift in how simultaneity is defined in relativity. During the turnaround, the traveling twin must recalculate which Earth events are simultaneous with their current position, and this jump in simultaneity results in a leap forward in the Earth twin's age from the traveler's point of view. So, while each twin sees the other's clock ticking slowly during the portions of the journey when they are moving at constant speed, the traveling twin's acceleration makes their experience of time fundamentally different from that of the stationary twin. As a result, the asymmetry leads to a consistent and non-contradictory outcome: the traveling twin is younger upon return. The twin paradox highlights the non-intuitive nature of time in Einstein's relativistic universe. It forces us to rethink basic notions such as simultaneity, duration, and motion. It shows that time is not an absolute backdrop flowing at the same rate for everyone, but a dimension intertwined with space, affected by velocity and gravity. Far from being a flaw in the theory, the twin paradox is actually a striking demonstration of relativity's predictive power, and it has been borne out in countless experiments. What makes it so intriguing is how it confronts our deeply ingrained expectations about the passage of time and shows that the universe behaves in ways that often defy common sense, but not logic or physics. The card paradox. The card paradox is a self-referential logical puzzle that creates a contradiction by using language in a way that defies classical notions of truth and falsehood. Like the liar paradox, this statement is false. The card paradox challenges the foundations of logical reasoning by presenting a statement that cannot consistently be assigned a truth value. The paradox is often described as follows: imagine a card with writing on both sides. On side A, it reads, "The sentence on the other side of this card is true." Then you flip the card over to side B, which says, "The sentence on the other side of this card is false." At first glance, this seems like a simple exchange of statements. But as soon as you try to evaluate their truth, you enter a loop that leads to a contradiction. Let's say the sentence on side A is true. That means that what it says is correct, so the sentence on side B is indeed true. But side B says that the sentence on side A is false. So if side B is true, then side A must be false. That contradicts our original assumption that side A is true. On the other hand, let's assume that the sentence on side A is false. Then what it says is not true, so the sentence on side B is not true. But side B claims that side A is false, and if that's not true, then side A must be true. Again, contradiction. In either case, whether you assume the sentence on side A is true or false, you are forced into a loop where each side's truth depends on the other in a way that leads to inconsistency. The statements are structured in a mutually dependent and self-referential fashion, which prevents either from having a stable truth value. This makes the card paradox a version of a semantic paradox, a statement, or pair of statements, that fails to be either true or false due to the way language and reference are being used. Philosophically and logically, this paradox highlights the difficulties that arise when systems allow self-reference, that is, when sentences refer to their own truth conditions directly or indirectly. These kinds of puzzles have had major implications for logic, especially in the 20th century with developments like Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which showed that any sufficiently powerful formal system will contain statements that are true but unprovable within the system, or statements whose truth cannot be determined at all. In short, the card paradox reveals that natural language, when allowed to bend back on itself, can give rise to logical structures that defy classical binary logic. It reminds us that truth is not always a simple matter of yes or no. Sometimes, the very structure of our reasoning traps us in contradiction. The Lottery Paradox. The Lottery Paradox is a thought-provoking logical and epistemological puzzle that highlights the tension between rational belief, probability, and consistency. First introduced by the philosopher Henry E. Keiberg, Jr. in the 1960s, the paradox challenges the idea that we can reasonably hold beliefs based on high probability while still maintaining overall logical coherence among those beliefs. Imagine a fair lottery with 1,000 tickets, and only one winning ticket. The drawing is perfectly random, and every ticket has exactly a 1 in 1,000 chance of winning. Now consider the following reasoning. For any single ticket, say, ticket number 137, it is extremely probable that it will not win. In fact, the probability that ticket number 137 will lose is 999 out of 1,000. That's a very high probability, so high that it seems reasonable to believe that ticket number 137 will lose. By this same reasoning, it seems equally rational to believe that ticket number 1 will lose, that ticket number 2 will lose, and so on, all the way up to ticket #1000. Each individual ticket has such a small chance of winning that it appears perfectly reasonable to believe of each one that it will not win. But here's where the paradox strikes: if you believe that every ticket will lose, then you are effectively believing that no ticket will win. That, however, contradicts your knowledge that this is a fair lottery and that one ticket must win. Thus, you hold a collection of individually reasonable beliefs that, when taken together, lead to an irrational or contradictory conclusion. The lottery paradox reveals a troubling inconsistency in our notion of rational belief. On one hand, it seems rational to believe something that is highly probable. On the other hand, if we accept too many such beliefs, we risk assembling a set of beliefs that are collectively inconsistent with what we know to be true. So the paradox exposes a conflict between three plausible principles. Rational belief principle: if a proposition is highly probable, it is rational to believe it. Closure under conjunction: if it is rational to believe each of a set of propositions, then it is rational to believe their conjunction, i.e., that they are all true together. Consistency principle: one should not hold a set of beliefs that are jointly inconsistent. The lottery paradox shows that these three principles cannot all be true at once. Something has to give. Philosophers and logicians have taken different approaches to resolving this dilemma. One response is to reject closure under conjunction, arguing that it may be rational to believe each proposition individually, but not rational to believe them all together. Another approach is to revise the standards for rational belief, suggesting that high probability is not enough to warrant belief, perhaps only certainty or near certainty should suffice. Others explore non-classical logic systems or probabilistic epistemology, where belief is treated not as a binary, true or false, but as a spectrum, allowing for degrees of belief without committing to outright belief in any specific outcome. The lottery paradox is more than a quirky puzzle. It has deep implications for how we think about knowledge, probability, and rational behavior. It is especially relevant in fields like decision theory, artificial intelligence, legal reasoning, and statistics, where people and systems must often make judgments under uncertainty. The paradox reminds us that even highly reasonable beliefs can lead to irrational conclusions if we're not careful about how those beliefs fit together. The Sleeping Beauty Paradox. The Sleeping Beauty Paradox is a philosophical thought experiment that explores the complexities of probability, belief, and self-locating uncertainty. First formally introduced by philosopher Adam Elga in the early 2000s, the paradox has become one of the most widely debated puzzles in contemporary epistemology and decision theory. At its core, it asks a deceptively simple question: How should a person update their beliefs when they awaken in a situation involving uncertainty about their temporal location? The setup is as follows. Sleeping Beauty agrees to participate in an experiment. On Sunday night, she is put to sleep. A fair coin is then flipped. If the coin lands heads, she is awakened on Monday, interviewed, and then the experiment ends. If the coin lands tails, she is awakened on Monday, interviewed, put back to sleep with her memory of that awakening erased, and then awakened again on Tuesday for a second interview. In either case, she has no memory of how many times she has been awakened. Every time she wakes up, she is in an identical room, with no clues as to what day it is or how many times she has already been woken. The key question is, when she wakes up during the experiment, what should her credence, subjective probability, be that the coin landed heads? This is where the paradox begins. Two seemingly valid lines of reasoning produce conflicting answers. The halfers position, credence equals 1/2. The halfer argument holds that Sleeping Beauty should assign a half probability to heads because the coin is fair, and nothing that happens during the experiment changes the objective chance of the coin landing heads or tails. Her awakening was guaranteed in either case, so waking up gives her no new evidence about the coin toss. Since the coin flip is still the only random event in play, and it was fair, the chance of heads remains 50%. The thirders position, credence equals 1/3. The thirder argument takes a different route, focusing on the number of awakenings that result from each possible coin outcome. If the coin lands heads, there is one awakening, Monday. If it lands tails, there are two, Monday and Tuesday. Given that Beauty doesn't know which day it is when she wakes up, and all awakenings are indistinguishable, she has to consider the relative frequency of those awakenings. There are three possible awakening instances, heads Monday, tails Monday, and tails Tuesday. Only one out of those three corresponds to heads. Thus, her credence in heads should be 1/3, and in tails, 2/3. The paradox lies in the fact that both sides use reasonable-sounding logic. The halfers rely on the fairness of the coin and the idea that no new information has been provided. The thirders focus on self-locating belief and the frequency of subjective experiences. The disagreement reflects deeper questions about how probability should behave when it relates not just to events in the world, but to one's own place within those events. The Sleeping Beauty paradox is not just a curiosity, it touches on important issues in epistemology, decision theory, and even the philosophy of time. It raises questions about how we should reason under conditions of imperfect information, especially when our own memory or awareness is part of the puzzle. It also has implications for fields like quantum mechanics and anthropic reasoning, where observers must reason about situations they themselves are embedded in. In the end, the paradox remains unresolved in philosophical circles, with compelling arguments on both sides. The halfer versus thirder debate continues to fuel discussions on how probability interacts with consciousness, time, and uncertainty. What makes the Sleeping Beauty paradox enduringly fascinating is not that it defies logic, but that it forces us to consider what kind of logic we're using when we assign belief in a world that includes ourselves. The Barber Paradox. The Barber Paradox is a self-referential logical puzzle that illustrates a fundamental problem in the concept of definition and set membership, particularly in the context of self-reference and contradictions. It was introduced by the British mathematician and logician Bertrand Russell in the early 20th century to demonstrate a problem in naive set theory, and is often presented in the form of a quaint village scenario. The paradox is framed as follows: in a village, there is a barber who is defined as the person who shaves all those, and only those, who do not shave themselves. The question then arises, does the barber shave himself? At first, the situation seems like a harmless riddle, but when we attempt to answer it, a contradiction quickly emerges. If the barber shaves himself, then according to the definition, he must not shave himself, because he only shaves those who do not shave themselves. But if he does not shave himself, then he fits into the category of those who are shaved by the barber, which means he must shave himself. In either case, we arrive at a contradiction: he shaves himself if and only if he does not shave himself. This creates an impossible and logically inconsistent situation. The underlying problem here is that the definition of the barber is self-referential and circular in a way that leads to inconsistency. The set of all people who do not shave themselves cannot consistently include the person who shaves all such people without running into logical trouble when that person is considered a member of the set. The contradiction exposes a limitation in the way sets or conditions can be defined when self-reference is involved. Russell introduced the Barber Paradox not as an actual problem about barbers, but as an illustration of a deeper issue in naive set theory. In naive set theory, it was assumed that any coherent condition could define a set. For example, one might try to define the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. The problem is, when you ask whether this set contains itself, you end up in a situation structurally identical to the Barber Paradox: if it does contain itself, then by definition it must not, and if it does not contain itself, then by definition it must. This contradiction demonstrated that naive set theory, which lacked restrictions on how sets could be formed, was inconsistent. To resolve this problem, Bertrand Russell developed what became known as Russell's theory of types, which introduced a hierarchy to avoid such self-referential definitions. In this theory, sets, or predicates, are organized into levels, where a set at one level can only contain elements from a lower level, not from the same or higher levels. This prevents a set from containing itself or being defined in terms of itself, thereby avoiding the kind of contradiction seen in the Barber Paradox. Thus, the Barber Paradox serves as a memorable and accessible metaphor for a much deeper logical and mathematical issue. Its deceptive simplicity highlights the dangers of unrestricted self-reference and the importance of carefully constructed logical frameworks. Although it may appear to be a whimsical thought experiment, the paradox underscores profound limitations in language, definition, and logic that continue to influence mathematics, computer science, and philosophy to this day. The Liar Paradox. The Liar Paradox is a fascinating and enduring problem in logic and philosophy that emerges when a statement refers to itself in a way that leads to a contradiction. The most well-known and straightforward example of this paradox is the sentence, "This statement is false." At first glance, this seems like a simple declarative sentence, but upon closer inspection, it reveals a deep and perplexing logical inconsistency. To see the paradox in action, one must attempt to evaluate the truth value of the statement. If the statement, "This statement is false," is true, then what it asserts must hold, namely, that it is false. But if it is false, and yet we assumed it was true, we reach a contradiction. On the other hand, if the statement is false, then what it asserts is not the case. In other words, the statement is not false, which would mean it is true. This too leads to a contradiction. Thus, whether we assume the statement is true or false, we are driven into a logical loop where each possibility negates itself. It is not merely a case of not knowing whether the statement is true or false, rather, it is a case where assigning either truth value results in a contradiction. This is what gives the Liar Paradox its distinctive and troubling nature. Historically, the roots of this paradox can be traced back to the ancient Greeks. The philosopher Epimenides, himself a Cretan, famously declared that all Cretans are liars. If his statement is taken to be true, then as a Cretan, he is a liar, which would mean his statement is false. But if it is false, then not all Cretans are liars, in which case he could be telling the truth. This circularity, present in both the ancient and modern versions, reveals a fundamental challenge in self-referential statements, especially those that make claims about their own truth value. The liar paradox has significant implications beyond wordplay or philosophical amusement. It has influenced major developments in logic, mathematics, and the philosophy of language. In the 20th century, it played a crucial role in prompting inquiries into the foundations of mathematics and formal systems. The logician Kurt Gödel, for example, constructed his famous incompleteness theorems using a method of self-reference inspired by the logic of the liar paradox. His work demonstrated that any sufficiently powerful formal system cannot be both complete and consistent, and he used a form of self-referential sentence that effectively says, "This statement is not provable," which echoes the logical structure of the liar. Attempts to resolve or bypass the paradox have led to various philosophical and logical strategies. Some have proposed that language must be structured in hierarchical levels, so that statements cannot refer to their own truth within the same level of language. This was the approach taken by the logician Alfred Tarski, who suggested that a clear separation between object language, where statements are made, and meta-language, where statements about statements are made, could prevent the kind of self-reference that produces the paradox. Others have proposed non-classical logics, such as paraconsistent logic, which allows for contradictions without rendering the entire logical system trivial. Another approach is dialetheism, the view that some contradictions can actually be true, that a statement can be both true and false at the same time. Though controversial, this position offers a radical way to accept and contain the paradox rather than eliminate it. Despite the variety of proposed resolutions, the liar paradox continues to challenge our understanding of truth, language, and logic. Its simple structure conceals a depth that continues to engage philosophers, logicians, and linguists alike. It highlights the complexities and potential limitations of formal systems and draws attention to the peculiarities of self-reference, making it not only a philosophical curiosity but also a vital subject of inquiry in the study of reasoning and meaning. The Bootstrap Paradox. The Bootstrap Paradox is a fascinating and perplexing logical paradox rooted in the concept of time travel. It occurs when an object, piece of information, or person is sent back in time and becomes trapped within an infinite loop, having no clear point of origin. Essentially, it challenges the conventional understanding of causality, where causes precede effects, by creating a closed causal loop where the origin of something becomes impossible to determine. To illustrate the paradox, imagine a scenario involving a time traveler who reads a famous novel, such as Hamlet, in the present. The time traveler is so inspired by it that they decide to go back in time and meet William Shakespeare. However, upon arriving in the past, they discover that Shakespeare never wrote Hamlet. To preserve the literary timeline, the time traveler gives Shakespeare a copy of the play, and Shakespeare then publishes it under his name. Centuries later, the time traveler reads the very same Hamlet, but now the question arises, who actually wrote the play? The play exists because it was given to Shakespeare by someone who read it in the future. But if the time traveler only had access to the play because it already existed, and Shakespeare never originally created it, then the play seemingly has no point of origin. It was never truly written, it simply exists in a self-perpetuating loop. This paradox is named after the phrase, pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps, which refers to achieving something impossible without any external support, like lifting oneself into the air by tugging on one's own shoelaces. In the case of the Bootstrap Paradox, something comes into being without an origin, creating a logical inconsistency. The paradox becomes especially problematic when applied to information. If knowledge from the future is sent into the past and used to recreate itself in the future, then where did that knowledge come from? It undermines the foundation of causality and raises metaphysical questions about creation and authenticity. Some interpretations of time travel, such as those found in certain branches of theoretical physics or science fiction, attempt to resolve the paradox by proposing that the universe allows self-consistent time loops. According to these models, the events in the loop are fixed and cannot be altered, thereby avoiding contradictions but still leaving the mystery of origin intact. Ultimately, the Bootstrap Paradox illustrates one of the most mind-bending consequences of time travel, the possibility that something might exist simply because it exists, with no definitive beginning. It's a paradox that continues to intrigue philosophers, physicists, and storytellers alike, as it forces us to question the very nature of cause and effect, linear time, and reality itself. The Sorites Paradox. The Sorites Paradox, also known as the heap paradox, is a classic logical and philosophical puzzle that arises from vague predicates, terms or concepts that do not have a precise boundary. The name Sorites comes from the Greek word soros, meaning heap, and the paradox illustrates the problems that emerge when we try to reason about concepts like heap, tall, rich, or bald, where the transition between one state and another is gradual and lacks a sharp cutoff. The paradox is typically framed like this: imagine you have a heap of sand. If you remove one grain of sand from the heap, you would still consider it a heap. If you remove another grain, it still seems to be a heap. In fact, removing just one grain of sand doesn't seem sufficient to change it from a heap into something that is no longer a heap. But if you continue this process, removing one grain at a time, eventually you are left with just a single grain of sand, which clearly is not a heap. So where, exactly, does the heap cease to be a heap? Is it after one grain is removed? After 10? 100? The paradox emerges from this lack of a clear boundary, although it seems reasonable to say that removing a single grain doesn't destroy the heap. Applying that logic repeatedly leads us to the absurd conclusion that even a single grain must still be a heap, or conversely, that no heap ever existed to begin with. This puzzle exposes the challenges posed by vague terms, words that have borderline cases and resist precise definition. In everyday language, we use such terms constantly and unproblematically. We call people tall, rich, old, or young, without needing to specify exact measurements. But when those terms are subjected to rigorous logical reasoning, their imprecision leads to problematic or paradoxical conclusions. Philosophers and logicians have offered several responses to the Sorites paradox, though none has achieved universal agreement. One common approach is to reject the principle of tolerance, which is the assumption that small changes cannot affect classification. According to this view, there must be a sharp cutoff point somewhere, even if we cannot identify it, at which a heap becomes a non-heap, or a person becomes bald, or poor, or short. This response insists that the paradox only arises because we assume every small step makes no difference. Another response is fuzzy logic, which allows truth to exist in degrees. Instead of classifying a pile of sand as either a heap or not a heap, fuzzy logic assigns a degree of heapness, so a pile might be 0.95 heap or 0.30 heap, depending on the number of grains. This avoids the abrupt shift from heap to non-heap and aligns better with how humans often think in practice, but it comes at the cost of complicating the binary logic used in classical reasoning. Some philosophers adopt an epistemicist view, arguing that there is in fact a precise boundary, but we simply do not know where it lies due to limitations in our knowledge or language. Others, called supervaluationists, suggest that vague terms do not have a single true definition, but a range of admissible interpretations, and that statements involving vague terms may lack a truth value in borderline cases. At its core, the Sorites paradox challenges our assumptions about categories, boundaries, and the nature of meaning. It exposes a gap between the discrete nature of logic and the continuous, imprecise character of natural language. Despite its apparent simplicity, it forces us to question how we make distinctions and whether some of the categories we use daily have any objective grounding. The paradox remains an active topic in philosophy of language, epistemology, and formal logic, as it touches on the fundamental question of how we draw lines in a world that often resists being divided into neat compartments. Buridan's bridge. Buridan's bridge is a classic logical paradox involving self-reference, conditional promises, and contradiction, attributed to the 14th-century French philosopher Jean Buridan. Like other paradoxes from medieval logic, it plays with language and reasoning to expose the limits and complications of truth, especially when statements refer to themselves or are embedded in conditional logic. The scenario unfolds as follows: Socrates is attempting to cross a river, but a guard stands at a bridge and tells him, "If you say something true, I will let you cross. But if you say something false, I will throw you into the water." Socrates then replies, "You will throw me into the water." Now the guard faces a dilemma. If he throws Socrates into the water, then Socrates' statement was true. But the rule says that if Socrates tells the truth, he must be allowed to cross. So throwing him in would be punishing him for telling the truth, which contradicts the rule. On the other hand, if the guard allows Socrates to cross, then Socrates' statement, "You will throw me into the water," was false. But the rule says that if Socrates lies, he must be thrown into the water. In this case, the guard is rewarding him for lying, which again violates the condition he originally set. The paradox arises because Socrates' statement creates a contradiction no matter how the guard acts. If it's true, it must be false, and if it's false, it must be true. Much like the liar paradox, this statement is false. Buridan's bridge creates a self-referential loop in which the condition for action collapses under logical inconsistency. At the heart of the paradox is the problematic nature of conditional rules when they encounter statements that involve predictions about those very rules. Socrates is not simply stating a fact, he's making a conditional claim that depends on how the guard will react. That circular dependency generates a contradiction. Buridan likely posed the paradox not just as a brain teaser, but as a demonstration of how careful one must be in setting logical conditions and interpreting language. It anticipates later developments in logic and philosophy, especially those dealing with self-reference, semantic truth, and the challenges of conditional reasoning. Some philosophers and logicians have attempted to resolve the paradox by denying that Socrates' statement can have a determinate truth value. It is neither strictly true nor false, which breaks the loop but introduces the idea that not all statements neatly fit into binary categories. Others suggest that such paradoxes are a reminder of the limitations of rule-based logic when applied to language that can reflect back upon itself. In the end, Buridan's bridge is more than just a medieval riddle. It challenges us to think about the complexities of communication, prediction, and the fragile line between truth and contradiction when logic begins to fold in on itself. Hilbert's Hotel. Hilbert's Hotel is a famous thought experiment conceived by the German mathematician David Hilbert to illustrate the bizarre and counterintuitive properties of infinity, specifically, infinite sets. It is not a paradox in the sense of a contradiction, but rather a logical scenario that challenges our everyday intuition about space, quantity, and limits. Imagine a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, all numbered sequentially, room 1, room 2, room 3, and so on, stretching endlessly. Now suppose that every single room is occupied. In a conventional hotel with a finite number of rooms, this would mean the hotel is completely full and cannot accept any more guests. But Hilbert's Hotel is no ordinary place. Here's where the strange part begins. Even though the hotel is fully occupied, it can still make room for a new guest. The manager simply asks each guest to move from their current room NN to room N+1 N+1. The guest in room 1 moves to room 2, the guest in room 2 moves to room 3, and so on. Since the hotel is infinite, everyone has a new room to move into. This opens up room 1 for the new guest, despite the hotel being full before. The paradox becomes even more striking. Suppose an infinite busload of new guests arrives. Can the hotel still accommodate them? Incredibly, yes. The manager now shifts each existing guest from room NN to room 2N2N, doubling every room number. Now all the even-numbered rooms are occupied, and all the odd-numbered rooms are empty, an infinite number of them, ready for the new guests. The newcomers can be placed in rooms 1, 3, 5, 7, and so on. This thought experiment reveals that the rules governing infinite sets are vastly different from those that apply to finite quantities. In everyday experience, adding more people to a full space is impossible. But in the realm of infinite mathematics, an infinite set can be rearranged to accommodate more elements, even infinitely more, without increasing the actual size of the set in a meaningful way. This is because infinite sets can have proper subsets that are just as large as the whole, a property that defies finite logic. Hilbert's hotel also illustrates the concept of countable infinity, where elements can be put into a one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers. The paradox doesn't violate mathematical principles, rather, it exposes the unsettling implications of those principles when applied to the infinite. It raises questions about infinity not only in mathematics, but in physics, cosmology, and metaphysics, such as the nature of an infinite universe or the possibility of infinite time. In essence, Hilbert's hotel shows that infinity is not just a very large number, it's a different kind of entity altogether, with rules that twist and stretch the boundaries of common sense. It invites us to see infinity not as unreachable or vague, but as a concept that can be precisely defined and explored, though never entirely tamed. Moore's Paradox. Moore's paradox is a fascinating and subtle philosophical puzzle first articulated by British philosopher G. E. Moore in the early 20th century. It does not involve a contradiction in logic per se but highlights a peculiar inconsistency between belief and assertion. The paradox arises when someone makes a statement like, "It's raining, but I don't believe that it's raining." On the face of it, there's nothing logically contradictory about this sentence. The two clauses, "It's raining" and "I don't believe that it's raining," can both be true at the same time. For instance, it could be raining, and a person might genuinely not believe it due to being indoors or having faulty weather information. There's no violation of formal logic here. However, asserting such a sentence seems absurd. If someone were to sincerely say, "It's raining, but I don't believe it's raining," we would find their statement bizarre, even incoherent, not because it's logically false, but because it violates deeper norms of rational communication. That is the essence of Moore's paradox, the paradox of how a sentence can be logically consistent, yet pragmatically or psychologically incoherent to assert. The same structure appears in related statements, like, "It's sunny, but I don't think it is." "She is guilty, but I don't believe she is." "I went to the party, but I don't believe I did." All of these are examples of what philosophers call Moorean sentences. The paradox becomes even sharper when we consider the first-person case in terms of belief. "It's raining, but I don't believe that it's raining," is essentially saying, "I believe that it's raining, but I don't believe that it's raining," which collapses into a kind of epistemic self-contradiction. One cannot coherently believe both parts of the sentence at the same time, even if they are not logically contradictory. Moore's paradox forces us to distinguish between truth and assertability. A statement might be true and yet not something that can be sincerely or meaningfully said. It also raises questions about self-knowledge, particularly about the relationship between belief and assertion. Normally, when a person makes a declarative statement, they are implicitly asserting that they believe what they are saying. So to say something and simultaneously deny believing it undermines the very purpose of speaking, to convey what one takes to be true. This paradox has implications for the philosophy of mind, epistemology, and the theory of language. In the realm of belief, it touches on the idea that we are supposed to have privileged access to our own mental states. If someone says, "I don't believe it's raining," they are presumably reporting honestly on their internal state. But if they also say, "It's raining," they are affirming the truth of something they explicitly say they don't believe. That conflict creates a kind of cognitive dissonance that is difficult to reconcile. Philosophers have tried to explain Moore's paradox by looking at the norms of belief and assertion. One idea is that belief and assertion are normatively linked. To assert a proposition sincerely is to express a belief in that proposition. Therefore, to assert a Moorean sentence is to violate this basic norm of coherence between what we say and what we believe. Another explanation focuses on the expressive function of language. When we speak, we don't just state facts, we also reveal things about ourselves, including our mental states. A Moorean assertion thus fails not as a statement of fact, but as an act of communication. In summary, Moore's paradox isn't a contradiction in logic, but a puzzle of rationality and language. It exposes the deep connection between what we believe, what we say, and how we expect others to interpret our words. It invites us to think more carefully about the hidden rules governing assertion and belief, and why certain combinations of truth claims, though logically consistent, are impossible to utter without sounding irrational. Quine's Paradox. Quine's paradox is a curious and intricate puzzle in the realm of logic and semantics, attributed to the influential American philosopher and logician Willard Van Orman Quine. This paradox is less widely known than others like the Liar Paradox or Russell's Paradox, but it touches on deep issues in self-reference, truth, and the logic of language. At its core, Quine's paradox reveals how certain kinds of self-referential statements, those that refer to themselves indirectly, can generate contradictions or at least very strange outcomes. To understand Quine's paradox, it helps to consider it as a variant or cousin of the Liar Paradox, but expressed in a more indirect, structural way. The Liar Paradox arises when someone says, "This sentence is false," which leads to a contradiction. If the sentence is true, then it must be false, and if it is false, then it must be true. Quine's version avoids the direct self-reference of the Liar Paradox and instead constructs a paradox using a more subtle linguistic form. Quine proposed the following sentence: yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation, yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation. Now let's unpack what's going on here. The phrase, yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation, is not a complete sentence by itself. But when you precede that phrase with its own quotation, you get a full sentence, yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation, yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation. This sentence is making a claim about itself, but in an indirect way. It says that when you take the string, yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation, and put it after its own quotation, which is exactly what we did, it becomes a false statement. So the sentence is essentially asserting its own falsehood, much like the Liar Paradox, but without explicitly saying, "I am false." So the paradox unfolds like this. If the sentence is true, then what it says is the case, the sentence is false. But that's a contradiction. If the sentence is false, then what it asserts is not the case, which would mean that it does not yield falsehood when preceded by its quotation. In other words, it is true. Again, contradiction. Thus, we end up in a similar situation as the Liar Paradox, a sentence that cannot be consistently classified as either true or false. But what makes Quine's paradox unique is that it achieves this result without using any direct self-reference or indexicals like, "this sentence." Instead, it uses clever syntactic structure to simulate self-reference through quotation and concatenation. This paradox is significant because it challenges our understanding of how language refers to itself, and how truth can be attributed to sentences that mention themselves only indirectly. It underscores the complexities that arise when we try to formalize the semantics of natural language, especially when that language is capable of talking about its own components. Philosophically and logically, Quine's paradox is relevant to discussions of semantic paradoxes, truth theories, and the foundations of logic. It serves as a reminder that even well-formed, grammatically sound statements can lead to deep contradictions when they're allowed to refer, even obliquely, to their own truth status. In conclusion, Quine's paradox is a subtle and elegant twist on the problem of self-reference and truth. It reveals that the mere capacity of language to quote and refer back to itself, without overtly doing so, can be enough to produce logical instability. It stands as a warning to logicians and philosophers alike. Even the structure of sentences, if not carefully controlled, can become a breeding ground for paradox. Russell's Paradox. Russell's paradox is one of the most important and influential paradoxes in the history of logic and mathematics. Discovered by the British philosopher and logician Bertrand Russell in 1901, it revealed a fundamental flaw in what was then known as naive set theory, the straightforward idea that any definable collection of objects can be considered a set. This paradox shook the foundations of mathematics at the time, because it exposed an internal inconsistency in the very system on which much of mathematical reasoning was being built. To understand Russell's paradox, one must first understand the basic assumption of naive set theory. For any given property, there exists a set of all things that satisfy that property. For example, the set of all red objects, or the set of all even numbers, or even the set of all sets. In this framework, it also seems perfectly reasonable to consider sets that contain themselves as members, as well as sets that do not contain themselves. Russell's paradox arises when we consider the set R, defined as R equals the set of all sets that do not contain themselves as members. Now the question is, does R contain itself? If R does contain itself, then by definition it must not contain itself, because it only contains sets that do not contain themselves. This leads to a contradiction. On the other hand, if R does not contain itself, then it fits the definition of the sets that do not contain themselves, and therefore it must contain itself. Again, we arrive at a contradiction. This paradox is not just a clever puzzle, it exposes a deep inconsistency in naive set theory. If the system allows the existence of a set like R, then it permits logical contradictions, and any system that permits contradictions collapses, since from a contradiction, any statement can be proven true. In other words, if one contradiction is allowed in a formal system, the entire system becomes logically unreliable. Russell's discovery had enormous consequences. At the time, mathematics was undergoing a process of formalization, especially through the work of Gottlob Frege, whose goal was to ground all mathematics in logic. Frege's major work, Grundgesetze der Arithmetik, was nearly complete when Russell informed him of the paradox. In fact, Russell's letter reached Frege just before publication, forcing Frege to add a note of acknowledgement and concern. This marked a crisis in the foundation of mathematics, showing that formal systems based on unrestricted set formation could not be trusted. To address this crisis, Russell proposed a solution known as the theory of types. According to this theory, objects and sets are organized into a hierarchy of types. A set of type 1 can contain objects of type 0, a set of type 2 can contain sets of type 1, and so on. This hierarchy prevents sets from containing themselves, because a set cannot contain something of the same or higher type. By enforcing this restriction, the paradoxical set R, the set of all sets that do not contain themselves, can no longer be formed, as it would violate the rules of the type system. Russell's paradox also led to the development of more sophisticated systems of set theory, most notably Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, ZF, which, along with the axiom of choice, AC, forms the basis of modern set theory known as ZFC. In ZFC, sets can only be constructed according to specific rules, and the idea of a universal set, the set of all sets, is explicitly disallowed. This avoids the kind of self-referential definition that causes the paradox. In essence, Russell's paradox shows how even the simplest assumptions about collections can lead to deep and subtle contradictions if not carefully regulated. It was a turning point in the philosophy and foundations of mathematics, prompting a re-evaluation of how mathematical objects are defined and leading to the more rigorous formal systems used today. The paradox remains a central example in discussions of logic, language, and the limits of self-reference. The Catch-22 Paradox. The Catch-22 Paradox is a well-known logical and bureaucratic paradox that illustrates the impossibility of escaping a no-win situation due to self-contradictory rules. The term originates from Joseph Heller's 1961 novel Catch-22, in which the absurdities of military logic and institutional control are exposed through dark satire. Over time, Catch-22 has come to represent any situation where a person cannot achieve a goal because the conditions required to achieve it contradict or prevent one another. In the novel, the paradox is introduced through the story of a World War II bombardier named Yassarian, who desperately wants to be declared insane so that he can be excused from flying more dangerous combat missions. According to the military's rules, however, there's a problem. If a pilot wants to avoid dangerous missions, it shows a concern for self-preservation, clearly irrational behavior. Therefore, wanting to avoid flying more missions proves that you are sane, which disqualifies you from being declared insane and thus prevents you from being grounded. Here's how the logic of Catch-22 unfolds. If you don't ask to be grounded, you continue flying missions. If you do ask to be grounded, you must be sane, because only a sane person would want to avoid death. But if you're sane, you can't be grounded for insanity. Therefore, there is no way out, you're caught in a loop. This creates a closed system of logic that protects itself from contradiction by ensuring that all exits are blocked. The rules are internally consistent, but when applied to real life, they generate impossible conditions. You cannot escape because every attempt to do so proves you shouldn't be allowed to escape. Philosophically, the Catch-22 paradox exposes the abuse of formal logic in bureaucratic or authoritarian systems. It's not that the rules are unclear, they are often too clear, and that clarity becomes a trap. The individual is rendered powerless by a system that uses logic not to liberate but to control. It's a vivid demonstration of how circular reasoning, self-validating rules, or institutional contradictions can be used to sustain unfair structures. Outside of the novel, Catch-22 has entered common usage to describe any frustrating situation where the solution to a problem is blocked by the problem itself. For example, you need job experience to get a job, but you need a job to get experience. To get a loan, you need credit, to build credit, you need a loan. You can't get treatment unless you're diagnosed, but you can't get diagnosed without treatment. What makes the Catch-22 paradox powerful is not just its logical twist, but its emotional resonance. It captures the feeling of being trapped by institutions, rules, or social norms that are designed to be impenetrable, shifting, or self-justifying. In essence, the Catch-22 paradox shows how logic, when twisted to serve power, can become a mechanism of entrapment rather than liberation. It reminds us that reason alone, when divorced from compassion or justice, can become absurd, and even cruel. The Crocodile Paradox. The Crocodile Paradox is a classic thought experiment from ancient philosophy that explores the tension between logic, language, and self-reference. It's a version of a self-referential paradox, similar in spirit to the Liar Paradox, and it reveals how seemingly simple reasoning can become tangled when prediction and conditional statements are involved in a recursive loop. The paradox unfolds as follows: a crocodile snatches a child from a riverbank. The distressed parent pleads for the return of the child. The crocodile, capable of speech and bizarre logic, makes the following offer: I will return your child if and only if you correctly predict what I will do next. The parent, hoping to outsmart the crocodile, responds, You will not return my child. Now the paradox begins. The crocodile is caught in a dilemma. If he returns the child, then the parent's prediction, You will not return my child, was false. According to the deal, if the parent's prediction is wrong, the child should not be returned. But if the crocodile does not return the child, then the parent's prediction was correct, and under the terms of the agreement, the child should be returned. In both scenarios, the crocodile violates the conditions he himself laid out. If the parent is right, the child must be returned, but then the prediction becomes wrong. If the parent is wrong, the child must not be returned, but that makes the prediction right. The result is a logical contradiction in which no action the crocodile takes can satisfy the conditions of the agreement without simultaneously violating them. This paradox belongs to a broader category of self-referential or semantic paradoxes, where a statement refers to its own truth value or consequences in a way that defies consistent interpretation. It's related in structure to the Liar Paradox: this statement is false, and also to certain problems in game theory, legal reasoning, and artificial intelligence where recursive or contradictory conditions must be resolved. At its core, the Crocodile Paradox exposes the limitations of binary logic when applied to real-world language games and decision-making. It shows how a condition that depends on predicting a future action, especially when that prediction influences the action itself, can lead to a logical loop with no coherent resolution. Philosophers have long used this scenario to explore the boundaries of reason, predictability, and truth, as well as the challenges inherent in defining conditional promises. Thus, what seems like a fantastical and absurd tale, a talking crocodile issuing a riddle, becomes a window into some of the deepest problems in logic and semantics. The lottery of birth. The lottery of birth is not a paradox in the strict logical sense, like the Liar Paradox or Russell's paradox, but rather a philosophical and ethical dilemma that reveals deep inequalities in human society. It refers to the arbitrary nature of one's birth circumstances, such as nationality, race, gender, socioeconomic status, religion, and family background, which have an enormous impact on a person's life prospects, despite being entirely outside their control. The paradox arises from the tension between our belief in moral equality and the reality that people are born into radically unequal conditions that shape their entire lives. To put it simply, the lottery of birth is the idea that no one chooses the circumstances into which they are born, yet those circumstances often determine everything from access to education and healthcare, to exposure to violence, to chances of employment, freedom, and even survival. A child born in a wealthy country to educated parents immediately has a vastly different life trajectory than one born into poverty in a war-torn or oppressed region. And yet, society often treats individual outcomes as if they are earned or deserved, without adequately acknowledging the role of sheer accident. This leads to a kind of moral contradiction. We claim to value justice, fairness, and individual merit, yet much of what shapes a person's opportunities and outcomes comes down to the luck of where, when, and to whom they were born. For example, someone may be praised for being hardworking or successful, but much of that success may be enabled by a supportive upbringing, good schools, and financial stability. Likewise, People born into disadvantage are often blamed for their circumstances, even though they never had an equal starting point. Philosopher John Rawls famously addressed this issue through his concept of the original position and the veil of ignorance. He proposed that if people were to design a just society from behind a veil that prevented them from knowing their future position, whether rich or poor, male or female, healthy or disabled, they would choose principles that ensure fairness and equal basic rights for all. Rawls's thought experiment is grounded in a moral intuition that we should not allow arbitrary factors like birth to dictate someone's entire life. The paradox deepens when we consider how strongly we tend to identify with our birth group, our nation, religion, ethnicity, as if it were somehow chosen or earned. In reality, most people accept their inherited identity without question, often using it as a basis for pride or exclusion of others, despite it being the result of pure chance. This psychological attachment adds another layer of tension between the randomness of birth and the deeply entrenched systems of inequality and tribalism it supports. Some critics argue that societies often attempt to mask or justify this inequality through ideologies of meritocracy, suggesting that everyone gets what they deserve based on talent or effort. But the lottery of birth challenges this view, pointing out that equality of opportunity is a myth if people do not begin life with roughly equal conditions. The ethical implications are profound. If we take the lottery of birth seriously, it calls into question the moral legitimacy of inherited privilege, raises doubts about the fairness of current economic and political systems, and suggests a stronger obligation to help those less fortunate, not out of charity, but out of justice. It fuels debates about wealth redistribution, affirmative action, immigration, and global aid, and challenges individuals and governments to reconsider how they treat the idea of deservingness. In the end, the lottery of birth is not about a logical inconsistency, but a moral and societal paradox. How can we justify the enormous influence of arbitrary birth circumstances in a world that claims to believe in fairness and equal worth? It invites us to reflect on the ways we structure society and how we might better align our systems with the ideals of justice we so often profess. The Memory Erasure Paradox. The Memory Erasure Paradox is a philosophical and logical puzzle that arises when we consider the implications of deliberately erasing a memory, especially when the memory in question is about the erasure itself. It touches on themes of identity, consciousness, time, and self-reference, creating a loop in which knowledge and ignorance collapse into contradiction. The paradox is best illustrated through a thought experiment. Imagine a person agrees to undergo a procedure that will erase a specific memory, for instance, the memory of a traumatic event, or even the memory of undergoing the memory erasure procedure itself. The process is supposed to be absolute. Once complete, the person will have no recollection of what was erased. The paradox emerges when we ask: can a person know that a memory has been erased if the erasure was truly effective? And more provocatively, what happens if the memory to be erased is the knowledge that a memory will be erased? Let's say that just before the procedure, the person is told, "You will forget this conversation." If the memory is successfully erased, they won't remember that they were supposed to forget anything. But if they do remember it afterward, the procedure failed. And if they don't remember it, then there is no subjective sense that anything was erased at all, making the erasure undetectable and, from their point of view, meaningless. This creates a paradox of verifiability. The only way to know a memory was erased is to remember having had it, which defeats the purpose. But if you truly don't remember, there's no way to confirm the erasure. Thus, any successful memory erasure becomes logically inaccessible to the subject. The better it works, the less one can ever confirm it occurred. The paradox deepens when we introduce self-reference. Suppose the person leaves themselves a note before the procedure: "You chose to erase the memory of what happened on this day." After the procedure, they read the note and face a strange situation. They have no recollection of what the note refers to, but now they are aware that something is missing. The attempt to erase the memory did not eliminate the knowledge of erasure, it merely fragmented it. This resembles the catch-22 of forgetting. You cannot forget something if you're constantly reminded that you forgot it. In science fiction and ethics debates, this paradox is often invoked when discussing technologies like memory modification, neural implants, or drugs that can suppress traumatic recollections. While these scenarios may be hypothetical, they force us to consider, is forgetting something the same as never having known it? And if we deliberately remove knowledge from the mind, do we lose part of our identity, or simply create a blind spot that we can never fully explore? At its core, the memory erasure paradox illustrates the fragile and paradoxical nature of consciousness. Memory is not just a storage of past events, it is the very fabric through which we understand who we are and how we make sense of time. Erasing memory doesn't just alter content, it potentially disrupts the structure of the self. And when that process involves knowledge of the erasure itself, we enter a logically unstable space where knowing and not knowing cannot cleanly coexist. Thus, the paradox is not merely about neuroscience or technology. It is a reflection on the boundaries of human awareness, the impossibility of erasing a part of the self without, in some way, confronting the knowledge that the erasure has taken place, even if only through the silent, unsettling void it leaves behind. The Paradox of Analysis. The paradox of analysis is a philosophical puzzle that challenges our understanding of what it means to analyze or define a concept accurately. It was most clearly articulated by G. E. Moore and later refined by other philosophers, and it focuses on the apparent tension between informative analysis and conceptual equivalence. At its core, the paradox asks, how can an analysis of a concept be both correct and informative at the same time? To see how the paradox arises, consider what philosophers often try to do when they analyze a concept. They take a complex or unclear idea, such as knowledge, goodness, or freedom, and attempt to express its meaning more clearly using simpler or more fundamental terms. This process is called conceptual analysis. For example, a classic philosophical analysis might define bachelor as an unmarried adult male. That definition seems informative and helpful, it clarifies what the word means. But here is where the paradox appears. For an analysis to be correct, it must be logically equivalent to the concept being analyzed. That is, if the statement, a bachelor is an unmarried adult male, is truly an analysis, then being a bachelor and being an unmarried adult male must be exactly the same thing, in other words, they must mean the same. However, if the analysis is truly correct and the terms mean the same thing, then the analysis should be uninformative. If bachelor just means unmarried adult male, then stating it is no more enlightening than saying a bachelor is a bachelor. This leads to a dilemma. If the analysis is informative, then it must go beyond what is already known and provide new insight, but that suggests the two expressions are not identical in meaning, which would make the analysis incorrect. If the analysis is correct, then it merely restates the same thing in different words, and thus tells us nothing we didn't already know, making it uninformative. This is the paradox of analysis. How can we offer a definition or conceptual analysis that is both correct, logically equivalent to the concept being analyzed, and informative, providing genuine philosophical insight? It seems that we are caught between triviality and error. Philosophers have responded to this paradox in different ways. One approach is to distinguish between meaning and understanding. Even if two expressions have the same meaning in a strict logical sense, one may still be more illuminating or clarifying than the other. For example, someone might know the word bachelor, but not fully grasp its implications until it is unpacked in simpler terms. Thus, an analysis might be informative not because it changes the meaning, but because it changes our cognitive grasp of that meaning. Another approach distinguishes between conceptual equivalence and linguistic synonymy. Two phrases might refer to the same concept and be interchangeable in logical analysis, but still function differently in everyday language. Bachelor is a compact, culturally loaded term, while unmarried adult male is a more descriptive, technical one. The analysis is helpful precisely because it reveals what is contained implicitly within the concept. Some philosophers, particularly in the tradition of ordinary language philosophy, suggest that analysis is less about formal definitions and more about clarifying the ways we use words in everyday life. Others, especially in the analytic tradition, continue to treat conceptual analysis as a way to refine and expose the structure of our thoughts, even if the paradox reminds us that such work is subtle and easily misunderstood. In essence, the paradox of analysis raises a profound question about the nature of philosophical inquiry itself. It forces us to reflect on what we are doing when we analyze ideas. Are we discovering something new, or just saying the same thing more clearly? The paradox remains a powerful reminder of the complexity involved in defining, understanding, and explaining the very concepts that shape our thought. The paradox of fiction. The paradox of fiction is a compelling philosophical puzzle that explores how and why we have genuine emotional responses to fictional characters, events, and worlds, despite knowing that they are not real. It challenges our understanding of emotion, belief, and imagination, revealing a tension between what we know intellectually and what we feel emotionally when engaging with works of fiction such as novels, films, plays, or video games. At the heart of the paradox is a seeming contradiction between three highly intuitive claims. We can have genuine emotional responses to fictional entities. For instance, readers may weep over the death of Anna Karenina, feel fear when watching a horror film about vampires, or feel joy when a beloved fictional couple finally unites. These emotions seem real and meaningful. Physiological and psychological reactions occur as if the events were actually happening. We must believe that the object of our emotion exists in order to feel emotion about it. Traditionally, emotions like fear, grief, or pity are thought to require belief in the existence of their objects. For example, to be afraid of a tiger, one must believe that a tiger is actually present and poses a threat. Emotions, in this view, are grounded in how we perceive the actual state of the world. We do not believe that fictional characters or events actually exist. When reading a novel or watching a film, we understand that the people and situations are invented. We know that Hamlet is not a real person and that the tragic events in Romeo and Juliet did not actually occur. These three premises seem individually plausible, but taken together, they lead to a contradiction. If emotions require belief in the existence of their object, and we don't believe in the existence of fictional entities, then we shouldn't be able to experience real emotions toward them. And yet, we do, often deeply and sincerely. This is the paradox of fiction. We are emotionally moved by that which we know to be unreal. Philosophers have approached the paradox in several ways, each attempting to preserve two of the three claims by rejecting or reinterpreting the third. One approach is the cognitive theory, which denies that belief in the actual existence of the object is necessary for emotion. Proponents argue that imaginative engagement, not belief, is sufficient to elicit genuine emotions. We don't believe that the monster in a horror film is real, but we imagine it vividly and place ourselves in the situation. The emotional response arises from this imaginative act rather than from belief in the literal truth of the scene. Another view, the thought theory or make-believe theory, suggests that our emotional reactions to fiction are not quite the same as those we have toward real events. They are a kind of quasi-emotion. We experience feelings similar to genuine emotions, but they are triggered by thoughts or representations rather than real-world beliefs. According to this view, when we cry over a fictional death, it is not grief in the same sense as mourning a real person, but a kind of simulated or as-if grief. A third, more skeptical stance is to deny the first premise and argue that we are not actually feeling true emotions toward fictional entities. This view suggests that while we might display outward signs of emotion, like tears or increased heart rate, these are not real emotions in the philosophical sense because they lack the belief component. However, this view is less popular, as it seems to contradict our lived experience and the intensity with which people often respond to fiction. The paradox of fiction is not just a theoretical puzzle, it touches on broader questions about aesthetics, imagination, and human psychology. It reveals how deeply our minds can engage with hypothetical or unreal scenarios, and how fiction can shape our moral understanding, empathy, and worldview. Far from being a weakness or flaw in reasoning, our capacity to respond emotionally to fiction may reflect a unique and powerful aspect of human cognition, the ability to care deeply about what is not, and in doing so, explore what it means to be human. The Paradox of Inquiry. The Paradox of Inquiry, also known as Meno's paradox after its appearance in Plato's dialogue Meno, is a philosophical dilemma that challenges the very possibility of learning or gaining new knowledge. At its core, the paradox asks, how can we inquire into something we do not know? The paradox is introduced through a question posed by Meno to Socrates: how will you look for something when you don't know at all what it is? How will you know when you found it? This seemingly innocent question quickly reveals a deep philosophical puzzle. The argument goes like this: if you know what you're looking for, then inquiry is unnecessary, you already have the knowledge. But if you don't know what you're looking for, then you wouldn't recognize it even if you found it. Either way, inquiry seems impossible. To put it differently, knowledge appears to be caught in a logical bind. You either know something, in which case inquiry is pointless, or you don't know it, in which case inquiry is impossible. This creates a paradox. The process of seeking knowledge seems self-defeating. How can one bridge the gap between ignorance and understanding if both extremes rule out meaningful investigation? In response to this paradox, Plato offers a provocative solution through the theory of recollection. He suggests that the soul is immortal and has already acquired all knowledge before birth. What we call learning, then, is not truly the discovery of new information but the recollection of knowledge that the soul already possesses. In this view, inquiry becomes a process of remembering rather than discovering, thus dissolving the paradox. While Plato's theory is metaphysical and not widely accepted in modern philosophy, the paradox he presents remains deeply influential. It touches on questions central to epistemology. How do we come to know things? What initiates curiosity? How do we recognize truth when we find it? In contemporary terms, one might address the paradox by noting that inquiry often begins with partial knowledge or vague intuition. We may not know exactly what we're seeking, but we often have enough of a sense, through context, analogy, or experience, to formulate questions and recognize progress when it occurs. Modern cognitive science and philosophy of science both accept that humans operate with hypotheses, models, and educated guesses that guide exploration even in the absence of certainty. Thus, the paradox of inquiry does not prove that learning is impossible. Rather, it forces us to reflect more carefully on how inquiry begins and progresses. It reveals the subtle and often overlooked role of prior understanding, assumptions, and context in guiding the search for truth. In doing so, it becomes less a roadblock to knowledge and more a powerful invitation to examine how knowledge arises in the first place. The Paradox of Omniscience. The paradox of omniscience is a deep and philosophically challenging paradox that arises when we try to think rigorously about the concept of an all-knowing being, typically in theological or metaphysical contexts, such as the nature of God. At its core, the paradox explores whether the idea of omniscience, knowing everything that can be known, can be logically coherent, especially when it involves knowledge of free will, future actions, or certain kinds of self-referential truths. To understand the paradox, consider what omniscience is generally taken to mean: a being that knows all truths, past, present, future, necessary, and contingent. That includes everything that can be known, from the location of every particle in the universe to the outcome of every possible future event. Here's where the trouble begins. Suppose an omniscient being knows everything, including what every individual will do in the future. This raises a critical question: if someone's future actions are already known, are they truly free to act otherwise? In other words, if an omniscient being knows today that you will choose tea instead of coffee tomorrow, can you still freely choose coffee instead? If you can choose coffee, then the omniscient being's knowledge would be mistaken, contradicting omniscience. But if you cannot choose coffee, then your freedom to choose seems illusory. This is one form of the omniscience versus free will dilemma. The paradox arises because it seems we must either deny human free will or deny that the future can be known in advance. But the paradox doesn't end there. It also emerges in self-referential contexts. For example, could an omniscient being know a truth that it does not know? This sounds absurd, yet it exposes a contradiction. If the being knows that this statement is not known by the omniscient being, then it must be false, because the being knows it. But if it's true, then the being doesn't know it, and therefore is not omniscient. This creates a loop similar to the liar paradox. Another version involves the limits of what can be known. Are there unknowable truths? For example, some truths in mathematics, as shown by Gödel's incompleteness theorems, cannot be proven within a formal system. If omniscience includes only what is logically knowable, then perhaps it's not as all-encompassing as the concept implies. But if omniscience includes knowing the unknowable, the idea seems self-contradictory. Finally, there's the issue of personal omniscience. Can an omniscient being know what it's like to be someone else, with a different consciousness, subjective experience, or limitations? For example, can an omniscient being know what it feels like to be ignorant or surprised, without ceasing to be omniscient? If not, then omniscience may not include all experiential knowledge. But if it can, how can a being both know everything and genuinely experience ignorance? These tensions show that omniscience, when taken to its logical extremes, may be conceptually unstable. The paradox of omniscience, then, is not necessarily a formal contradiction, but rather a collision of ideas, between determinism and free will, between total knowledge and self-reference, between abstract truth and subjective experience. Philosophers and theologians have responded in various ways. Some suggest redefining omniscience more narrowly, limiting it to what is logically possible to know. Others propose models of divine knowledge that account for free will, such as middle knowledge, where God knows not only what will happen, but what would happen under any circumstance. Still others argue that true omniscience may include awareness of all logical paradoxes but not be bound by human conceptions of logic at all. In the end, the paradox of omniscience confronts us with a profound question: can the idea of knowing everything be made logically coherent, or is it ultimately a concept that, like infinity or perfection, challenges the limits of our understanding as much as it seeks to transcend them? The paradox of the court. The paradox of the court, also known as the Protagoras paradox, is an ancient logical dilemma that illustrates the complexities of legal reasoning and self-referential conditions in contractual agreements. It involves a famous sophist, Protagoras, and one of his students, Euathlus, and is often cited as a philosophical and legal puzzle with no clear resolution due to the circularity of its arguments. According to the story, Protagoras agreed to teach Euathlus the art of law and rhetoric on the condition that Euathlus would pay Protagoras for the lessons only after he won his first case in court. The agreement was intended as a practical and fair deal. Euathlus would only owe payment once his training proved successful in the real world. However, after completing his education, Euathlus did not take on any cases. He postponed entering the legal profession and thus, under the agreement, did not owe Protagoras any payment. Frustrated by this delay and feeling he was being cheated, Protagoras eventually sued Euathlus for the payment. What followed is the paradox itself, stemming from the conflicting legal arguments each party presented. Protagoras' argument was straightforward and seemingly airtight. If he won the case, then the court would compel Euathlus to pay him, and he would receive his money. But if Euathlus won the case, then he would have, by definition, won his first legal case, thus fulfilling the condition of the original contract, and would then have to pay Protagoras according to their agreement. In either outcome, whether the court ruled in favor of Protagoras or Euathlus, Protagoras argued he should be paid. Euathlus, however, had a similarly compelling counterargument. If the court ruled in his favor, then he would not have to pay Protagoras, since the court explicitly said so. If the court ruled against him, then he still would not have to pay Protagoras, because he still would not have won a case, this case being a loss, so the condition of the agreement would not be fulfilled. In both scenarios, Euathlus contended that he was not obligated to pay. This creates a paradox. Both parties have constructed valid-seeming arguments that appear to guarantee victory regardless of the outcome. The court finds itself in a logical bind. If it rules in favor of Protagoras, it indirectly fulfills the condition of the original agreement, which would mean Euathlus must pay. But if it rules in favor of Euathlus, then according to Protagoras' logic, Euathlus has won his first case and should pay anyway. On the other hand, ruling in favor of Protagoras may imply that Euathlus must pay before having won a case, violating the original contract. Yet ruling in favor of Euathlus also results in a contradiction, since it means he should not pay, despite having now met the condition that should trigger payment. The paradox of the court is not only a rhetorical and legal curiosity but also a lesson in the limits of contractual logic when it involves self-reference and conditional obligations. It bears resemblance to other logical paradoxes, such as the liar paradox or Russell's paradox, in that it deals with circular reasoning and contradictions that emerge when definitions or rules refer to themselves. This paradox highlights the importance of clear legal definitions and the dangers of conditional contracts that depend on future events with unclear boundaries. It also underscores how different interpretations of the same event or agreement can lead to fundamentally incompatible conclusions. To this day, the Protagoras paradox remains a powerful example of how law and logic intersect, and sometimes collide, in ways that challenge our understanding of fairness, obligation, and truth. The Paradox of the Courtroom Lie. The Paradox of the Courtroom Lie, sometimes referred to as the Epimenides paradox in a legal setting, is a self-referential logical puzzle that arises when a statement made under oath contradicts itself in a way that defies clear classification as either true or false. It blends elements of logic, language, and legal procedure, often leading to a dilemma where the legal system cannot resolve whether a lie has actually been told. The basic form of the paradox unfolds like this. Imagine a witness in a courtroom takes the stand, swears to tell the truth, and then says, "Everything I say in this courtroom is a lie." At first, this may seem like a bold or even humorous claim. But when analyzed logically, it leads to a contradiction. If the witness is telling the truth when they say, "Everything I say is a lie," then their statement must be true, meaning they always lie. But if that statement is true, then they have told the truth at least once, which contradicts the statement. On the other hand, if the witness is lying when they say, "Everything I say is a lie," then it must be false that all their statements are lies. That implies at least one of their statements is true, which could be this one. But if this statement is true, we're back where we started, it's a lie that is also true. This creates a self-referential paradox, akin to the liar paradox. This sentence is false, in logical form. The statement refers to itself and creates a loop of contradiction that cannot be resolved using standard binary logic. It is neither clearly true nor clearly false, and thus the legal system, relying on clarity, evidence, and definable truth, cannot determine whether the witness has committed perjury. In a courtroom context, the paradox highlights how language can break down when it becomes self-referential. Legal systems are built on the assumption that statements can be verified, falsified, or meaningfully interpreted. A statement that refers to its own truth value and contradicts itself challenges that framework. It's not just unclear, it's logically unstable. There are also broader philosophical implications. The paradox raises questions about truth in language, the limits of self-reference, and the fragility of communication in formal settings like the law. If a legal system is forced to interpret paradoxical statements as either lies or truths, it risks misrepresenting their logical status and making judgments that are not grounded in reality. In real life, courts usually avoid engaging with such abstract puzzles. If a witness made such a statement, it would likely be dismissed as evasive, incoherent, or disruptive rather than taken as a genuine claim. But the paradox remains valuable as a thought experiment, illuminating the complex relationship between language, logic, and truth, especially in settings that depend on precise definitions and clear answers. In essence, the paradox of the courtroom lie shows how the legal pursuit of truth can be confounded by the very structure of language itself. It reminds us that some statements are not just ambiguous or false, they are logically unresolvable, and that this can have serious implications when truth is treated as both a moral and legal foundation. The paradox of tolerance. The paradox of tolerance is a compelling and morally charged philosophical idea that explores the limits of a tolerant society. It was most famously articulated by Austrian philosopher Karl Popper in his 1945 book The Open Society and Its Enemies. At its heart, the paradox confronts a difficult question: should a tolerant society tolerate intolerance? On the surface, a fully tolerant society seems morally superior. It embraces freedom of speech, belief, and lifestyle, regardless of differences. But Popper warns that this ideal contains a hidden danger. If tolerance is extended without limit, even to those who are openly intolerant, then the very foundation of tolerance is at risk. Intolerant groups, if allowed unchecked freedom, may use the tools of democracy and free expression to erode, dismantle, or violently overthrow the tolerant system itself. The paradox unfolds as follows: if a society tolerates all views, including those that advocate suppressing or destroying tolerance itself, then over time, the intolerant can gain influence and power. Once strong enough, they may silence or eliminate the tolerant, thereby ending the open society. In this sense, tolerance taken to its extreme can lead to its own extinction. This idea is not just theoretical, it has real-world resonance. Totalitarian regimes throughout history, such as Nazi Germany, have demonstrated how democratic systems can be manipulated by extremist ideologies that exploit the freedoms they ultimately seek to abolish. What begins as a pluralistic society can become vulnerable if it fails to draw a line against those who openly reject pluralism. Popper does not argue for suppressing all controversial or dissenting ideas. Rather, he suggests that a tolerant society must be prepared to defend tolerance by refusing to tolerate intolerant ideologies that reject dialogue, reason, or the rights of others. This defense might involve limiting the rights of groups that incite violence, suppress opposing viewpoints, or deny the basic dignity of others. Paradoxically, then, intolerance of intolerance becomes a necessary condition for preserving a genuinely open and free society. Critics of the paradox of tolerance sometimes argue that it risks justifying censorship or authoritarian behavior under the banner of protecting democracy. Indeed, determining who is intolerant and when action should be taken is a delicate matter, fraught with political and ethical complexity. However, Popper's paradox is not an argument for blanket repression, it is a warning against moral naivety. Tolerance must be accompanied by vigilance and discernment, lest it be used as a weapon against itself. In essence, the paradox of tolerance asks us to recognize that unlimited openness can become self-defeating. It teaches that protecting a tolerant society may require the uncomfortable stance of drawing boundaries, not out of fear or bigotry, but out of a commitment to the very values that tolerance is meant to uphold: freedom, dignity, and peaceful coexistence. The Preface Paradox. The Preface Paradox is a subtle and intellectually intriguing puzzle that arises from the tension between reasonable belief, fallibility, and logical consistency. It is named after the common situation in which an author writes a preface to a book, acknowledging that while every individual claim made in the book is believed to be true, it is nonetheless likely that some error remains in the text. This paradox, which appears in discussions of epistemology and belief theory, challenges our assumptions about how beliefs should cohere. Consider the case of an author who has written a comprehensive non-fiction book containing dozens, or even hundreds, of factual claims. The author has carefully researched and verified each of these claims and, therefore, believes each one to be true. This belief is rational and sincere. Without it, the author would not have included the claims in the book. However, in the preface, the author candidly admits something like the following: although I believe each statement in this book is correct, I recognize that, given the scope of the material and the fallibility of human knowledge, it is very likely that at least one error remains. Here lies the paradox. The author holds a set of beliefs, one for each individual claim in the book, e.g., claim 1 is true, claim 2 is true, etc. But the author also believes a separate, collective proposition, that not all of the claims are true. In logical terms, this amounts to believing P and P2 and P3, and P, where each P is a claim in the book, while also believing not dash, P and P2 and P3, and P. That is, the author believes both that all the claims are true and that not all the claims are true, an apparent contradiction. This raises the question: is it rational to hold a set of beliefs that, when conjoined, conflict with another belief you also hold? The Preface Paradox suggests that the answer might be yes, under certain conditions. After all, it is entirely reasonable for an author, or any individual, to trust the truth of each well-supported statement while also acknowledging the general unreliability of human cognition, memory, or reasoning. This form of intellectual humility is not only common but often encouraged. The paradox highlights the difference between local justification and global consistency. Locally, it is rational to believe each individual claim if there is sufficient evidence for it. Globally, however, it is also rational, based on general knowledge of human error rates or the likelihood of mistakes in large projects, to believe that not every claim is true. The clash arises when these rational beliefs are held together, even though their conjunction leads to an inconsistency. Various philosophical responses to the Preface Paradox have been proposed. Some argue that we should abandon the idea that belief should be closed under conjunction, meaning that just because you believe a set of statements individually doesn't mean you should also believe their conjunction. Others propose distinguishing between belief and acceptance, where you accept claims for practical purposes, like writing a book, without committing to the belief that all are true simultaneously. Still others suggest we revise our understanding of rationality to allow for degrees of belief or partial commitment, acknowledging that not all rational belief systems are strictly consistent in the classical logical sense. Ultimately, the Preface Paradox draws attention to the complex nature of belief, evidence, and intellectual humility. It illustrates that rational agents can, indeed often must, navigate a world where certainty is rare, and error is probable, yet still make strong individual commitments to what they judge to be true. Like other epistemic paradoxes, it reveals the delicate balance between confidence in our reasoning and the acknowledgement of our fallibility. The Raven Paradox. The Raven Paradox, also known as Hempel's Paradox, is a thought-provoking problem in the philosophy of science that challenges how we understand evidence, confirmation, and logic. It was first proposed by the German logician Carl Gustav Hempel in the 1940s, and it reveals how intuitive ideas about confirming hypotheses can sometimes conflict with formal logic. At the heart of the paradox lies a seemingly simple hypothesis: all ravens are black. According to the principles of confirmation theory, every observation of a black raven should logically serve as confirmation for this general claim. So far, this seems entirely reasonable. However, Hempel pointed out that this statement is logically equivalent to another: all non-black things are not ravens. In formal logic, these two statements are contrapositive, they have the same truth value. Therefore, according to strict logic, observing a green apple, a non-black thing that is not a raven, should also count as evidence supporting the claim that all ravens are black. And that's where the paradox emerges. Intuitively, it seems absurd to say that noticing a green apple tells us anything meaningful about the color of ravens. While logic treats both forms of the statement as equivalent, our intuitive sense of relevance tells us that seeing a non-black non-raven doesn't provide real information about ravens at all. This contradiction between formal logic and intuitive reasoning creates the Raven Paradox. It forces us to reconsider how evidence should work in scientific reasoning. If we take the logical equivalence seriously, then every non-black non-raven in the universe, stones, clouds, white shoes, would incrementally confirm the hypothesis: all ravens are black. But this leads to a bizarre implication: we could theoretically confirm a hypothesis about ravens without ever observing a raven. Philosophers and scientists have offered various interpretations and attempted solutions to this paradox. Some suggest that although a non-black non-raven technically confirms the hypothesis, its confirmatory power is extremely weak, so negligible that it's practically irrelevant. Others argue that context matters. Evidence should be judged not only on logical structure but also on how directly it relates to the subject of the hypothesis. The Raven Paradox ultimately highlights a deep and unsettling problem in the philosophy of science: the difficulty of defining what counts as meaningful evidence. It shows that even straightforward ideas, like making generalizations from observations, can become surprisingly complex when examined through the lens of logic. This paradox continues to stimulate debate about the nature of scientific inference, the limits of formal reasoning, and the gap between logic and human intuition. The Self-Reference Paradox. The self-reference paradox is a foundational logical puzzle that arises when a statement refers to itself in a way that leads to contradiction, ambiguity, or logical instability. It lies at the heart of many famous paradoxes, including the liar paradox, Russell's paradox, and the card paradox, and has deep implications for logic, language, mathematics, and philosophy. At its simplest, the paradox appears in the form of a sentence like, "This statement is false." If the statement is true, then what it says must hold, so the statement is false. But if it's false, then what it says isn't true, which implies that it is true. Either way, we are caught in a loop: if it's true, it must be false; if it's false, it must be true. The statement refers to itself in a way that makes its truth value logically indeterminate. This is the classic form of a self-referential paradox, a statement that attempts to declare something about itself, producing a contradiction that can't be resolved within classical logic. What makes it paradoxical isn't that the sentence is hard to understand, but that it defies assignment of a consistent truth value. Self-reference becomes even more problematic when built into systems that are meant to be internally consistent. For example, in mathematics, Bertrand Russell discovered a version of this problem in set theory, known as Russell's paradox. He imagined a set of all sets that do not contain themselves. If such a set exists, does it contain itself or not? If it does, then by definition it shouldn't, and if it doesn't, then by definition it should. Again, self-reference creates an unsolvable contradiction. In computing, similar issues arise with recursive algorithms that don't have a base case, or with programs that try to analyze or predict their own behavior, leading to problems like the halting problem, famously explored by Alan Turing. Even in natural language, self-reference can create confusion or paradox. Consider phrases like, "I always lie." If the speaker is telling the truth, then the statement must be false, meaning they don't always lie. But if they're lying, then perhaps they don't always lie, which again undercuts the statement. The self-reference paradox challenges the core principles of formal systems and how we define truth. In classical logic, every proposition must be either true or false, but self-referential statements seem to break this rule. They suggest that some sentences cannot be classified within a binary truth framework. This insight led to major developments in logic during the 20th century. Most notably, Kurt Gödel used self-reference to prove his incompleteness theorems, which show that any sufficiently powerful formal system contains true statements that cannot be proven within the system itself. His approach involved constructing a statement that essentially says, "This statement is not provable in this system," a kind of self-reference that was mathematically rigorous and deeply consequential. In essence, the self-reference paradox exposes a vulnerability in systems that rely on rigid hierarchies of meaning and truth. When a system tries to include a rule that talks about all rules, including itself, it can collapse into contradiction. Various strategies have been developed to manage or avoid self-referential paradoxes. Hierarchical languages, like those proposed by Alfred Tarski, separate statements into levels so that a sentence cannot refer to its own truth value. Paraconsistent logics allow contradictions to exist without collapsing the entire logical system. Type theory in mathematics and programming avoid sets or functions that can refer to themselves in problematic ways. Each of these approaches acknowledges that self-reference is both powerful and dangerous, a tool that, when unchecked, can destabilize an entire system of reasoning. Ultimately, the self-reference paradox is not just a technical glitch or a linguistic curiosity. It is a deep philosophical challenge to our understanding of logic, truth, and the boundaries of thought. It shows that some of the simplest sentences we can construct, those that turn back on themselves, have the power to unravel even the most carefully built systems of meaning. Zeno's Achilles and the Tortoise. Zeno's Paradox of Achilles and the Tortoise is one of the most enduring puzzles in the history of philosophy, originating in ancient Greece around the 5th century BCE. Attributed to Zeno of Elea, this paradox was part of a series of arguments designed to support his mentor Parmenides' claim that motion and change are illusory. Among Zeno's paradoxes, the story of Achilles and the tortoise stands out as a particularly compelling challenge to our intuitive understanding of space, time, and movement. The paradox is usually presented as follows: the great Greek hero Achilles, known for his exceptional speed, agrees to race a tortoise, a creature famously slow. To make the race seem fairer, Achilles gives the tortoise a head start, say, 100 meters. Once the race begins, Achilles quickly runs toward the point where the tortoise started. However, in the time it takes Achilles to reach that point, the tortoise has moved a little farther ahead, perhaps just 10 meters. When Achilles covers that additional 10 meters, the tortoise has again moved forward, though by an even smaller distance, say 1 meter. Each time Achilles reaches the point where the tortoise was, the tortoise has advanced slightly farther. Zeno argued that this process could continue infinitely, with Achilles always arriving at the spot the tortoise has just vacated, but never quite catching up. Although the distance between them becomes smaller and smaller, it never entirely disappears. From this reasoning, Zeno concluded that motion itself must be an illusion, because if one can never overtake another even while clearly moving faster, our basic assumptions about space and time must be flawed. At first glance, this seems absurd. After all, in real life, we know Achilles would easily overtake the tortoise. Yet Zeno's argument exposes a subtle and deep logical problem involving infinite division. He forces us to confront the paradox of how an infinite number of steps, each representing Achilles reaching the tortoise's prior position, can be completed in a finite amount of time. The resolution to the paradox did not come until many centuries later, with the development of calculus by Isaac Newton and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz in the 17th century. Using the concept of limits, calculus shows how an infinite series of diminishing distances or time intervals can converge to a finite sum. Mathematically, although Achilles has to complete an infinite number of steps, the total time required can still be finite. For example, if each step takes half as long as the previous one, the total time forms a geometric series that converges to a specific number. This proves that Achilles will indeed overtake the tortoise after a finite period. Zeno's paradox, therefore, does not disprove motion but rather highlights the limitations of reasoning about infinity without precise mathematical tools. It shows how human intuition struggles with the concept of infinity and continuity, and how paradoxes can arise when we apply seemingly reasonable logic to such concepts. Beyond its mathematical implications, the Achilles and the tortoise paradox also invites deeper philosophical reflection. It questions how we understand progress, causality, and the nature of space and time. It challenges us to think about whether space is composed of indivisible units or infinitely divisible, and whether time flows smoothly or in discrete moments. Ultimately, Zeno's paradox remains a landmark in the history of thought, not because it disproves motion, but because it reveals the complexity of seemingly simple concepts. It compelled thinkers for over 2,000 years to refine their understanding of mathematics, physics, and logic, and it continues to be a fascinating example of how paradoxes can illuminate the boundaries of human knowledge.